On a bitter January evening in Chicago, a homeless shelter on West Madison Street sat cold and quiet under a gray winter sky. A woman in a worn wool coat sat alone on a bench out front. Just another elderly stranger to anyone passing by. But she was Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, chairwoman of Whitfield Capital Group, one of the most influential women in American finance. She had disguised herself to test the young man her daughter Claire had fallen in love with. That young man was Ethan Collins. He showed up that evening as a volunteer, crouched down in front of her without hesitation, and handed her a warm cup of coffee. "It's pretty cold out here. This isn't too sweet, just warm. Please take it." When Margaret deliberately provoked him with sharp words, he didn't flinch. Instead, he sat beside her and quietly said that his grandmother had passed away alone a few years ago, and that he hadn't been there with her. His voice was steady, but something in it was not. Margaret turned her face away. Slowly, so he wouldn't see. She had come to test him. But somewhere along the way, she had become the one being tested. And 3 days later Ethan found out who she really was. Ethan discovered the truth by accident. On his way back from a volunteer shift, he stopped at a small cafe near the shelter. He was waiting for his coffee when his eyes drifted to the television on the wall. It was a local business segment, and on the screen, a woman in a crisp blazer was speaking at a podium. The Whitfield Capital Group annual address. Ethan's hand stopped mid-reach for his cup. He set it back down on the table. The woman on the screen and the elderly woman on the bench 3 days ago. The lines of her face, the set of her jaw, the way she held her mouth when she was quiet. It was the same person. He was certain of it. He sat there for a long moment without moving, without expression. That evening, he called Claire. He kept his voice easy, like he was just making conversation. He asked whether her mother happened to spend much time over on the west side. Whether she'd been going out more than usual lately. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Brief, but full. That silence told him everything. Later, when Margaret heard about the call from Claire, her daughter's voice careful and low, saying that Ethan seemed to know, Margaret turned toward the window. Lake Michigan lay flat and gray beneath a heavy sky. The glass trembled faintly against the wind. "He knows." The words settled into her chest quietly, like something that had been waiting to arrive. And strangely, she wasn't afraid. What unsettled her was the fact that she wasn't afraid at all. So what would he do with that? Margaret waited. She expected something to shift. A phone call. An awkward message through Claire. Some change in his manner that would signal he was recalibrating, figuring out how to position himself now that the stakes were clear. But nothing happened. Ethan showed up to his next volunteer shift the same as always. Same time, same battered van, same jacket. He walked the same path along the benches, crouched down at the same eye level, stayed until the end. Nothing about him had changed. Margaret learned this through Claire, who mentioned it in passing. That Ethan had come home from volunteering and hadn't said much. Just that it had been a good day. That quietness unsettled Margaret more than any confrontation would have. She had expected several things from him. Eagerness, a sudden warmth that was just a little too deliberate. Or distance, the kind that comes from not knowing how to act around someone you've suddenly recategorized. Or hurt. She had half expected hurt. None of it came. Ethan simply continued being who he was, as though knowing who she was gave him no particular reason to be anyone different. Margaret found herself returning to that thought in the days that followed. At 4:30 in the morning, the newspaper open in front of her and the lake dark outside. She sat with her coffee and did not read. She set the cup down, looked out at the water, and picked it up again. What kind of person was that? It was Margaret who reached out first. She sent a short message through Claire, not a summons, just a quiet ask. Whether Ethan might have time to meet, just the two of them. She chose a small cafe near her office. Not the boardroom. Not the penthouse. A corner table in a neighborhood place where nobody would look twice. Ethan arrived 5 minutes early. Margaret was already there. She wore a simple beige sweater and dark slacks. No blazer. No jewelry beyond a plain watch. Her hands were folded on the table, empty, no documents, no phone, no pen. Ethan sat down across from her. A long silence settled between them. The sounds of the cafe filled the space, the low hiss of the espresso machine, quiet music. The occasional scrape of a chair. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her fingers, if you looked closely, were not quite still. She was the one who spoke first. She asked him whether what he'd said on that bench had been real. About his grandmother. About why he kept coming back to that shelter. Her voice was low and even not the voice she used in boardrooms. Just a voice. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, without words. And somehow, that was enough. Another silence. Margaret looked toward the window. Outside, Chicago moved past in its winter coat. People leaning into the wind, heads down, going somewhere. She watched them for a long moment. Then she turned back to Ethan. And in a voice smaller than any she had used in years, she said, "I'm glad Claire found you. Take care of her." The end of the sentence wavered, just slightly. She turned toward the window immediately after, smooth. Unhurried, as though she simply wanted to look outside. But her hand came up a moment later and pressed gently beneath her eye. Once. Very quickly. Ethan saw it. He didn't say anything. He didn't look away, and he didn't pretend not to notice. He simply reached across the table and set his hand down beside hers. Close enough to feel. Not quite touching. Outside, the wind moved past the glass. The window gave a low, quiet sound. Neither of them spoke until it faded. After that afternoon, things between Margaret and Ethan didn't change dramatically. There were no grand gestures, no formal announcements. But something had quietly shifted. On Sunday mornings, when the three of them had brunch at Claire's apartment, Margaret no longer watched Ethan the way she once had. Measuring, weighing, waiting for something to reveal itself. She simply watched him. The way he laughed with the corners of his eyes. The way he refilled Claire's coffee without being asked. Ethan's life stayed the same. Same neighborhood, same nonprofit, same worn jacket. Margaret never offered to change any of it. And Ethan never suggested she should. That, for Margaret, was its own kind of relief. One Sunday, after the dishes were cleared, Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, doing the washing up while Claire dried beside him. Margaret sat in the living room and watched them through the doorway. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, both of them talking. Softly, laughing at something she couldn't quite hear. She thought, so this is what it looks like when someone wants nothing. She held onto that thought for a long time. Margaret Whitfield spent 40 years believing she could read anyone. Not from resumes or references or the firmness of a handshake. From the unguarded moment, the way a person behaved when they believed no one of consequence was watching. That had been her method, and it had rarely failed her. But on a cold bench on West Madison Street, something she hadn't accounted for happened. She met someone who behaved exactly the same whether anyone was watching or not. And when the layers fell away, the disguise, the test, the careful distance she'd kept, what she found wasn't a threat, and wasn't a calculation. It was just a young man who showed up. And kept showing up, and asked for nothing. That is not a common thing. We spend a great deal of time measuring people. Where they come from, what they've built, what they carry with them. And there is nothing wrong with being careful. But sometimes, the truest measure of a person is simply this: what do they do when no one who matters is looking? Ethan Collins crouched down on a cold sidewalk. and handed a cup of coffee to a stranger. He didn't know that stranger would change his life. He didn't know anyone important was watching. He was just doing what he always did. And that turned out to be everything. A single warm cup, offered without condition. On a bitter January evening in Chicago. That was where it all began. And in the end, it was enough to open a door that 40 years of boardrooms never could. Thank you for staying with Margaret's story to the end. If it resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.